Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Cinemecast podcast, our movie review podcast, right here on YouTube and on Rumble. Make sure you guys leave a like down below, follow and subscribe if you guys enjoy the content here on these channels. And welcome to today's feature. This one is a very underrated crime comedy film from 1990 called Quick Change. And this one, yes, this is my first time seeing this movie, and I gotta say, I was quite impressed by it, even though it was received as a commercial failure, but it did receive positive reviews with praises to main star actors Bill Murray's performance and humor. Now, I know I'm coming off very strong with this. There is a little bit to talk about with this movie, because this movie plays out very properly the way that it should, in a sense. And of course, by looking at the poster right there, you probably may have seen clips of this movie floating around on social media or on YouTube with Bill Murray playing a clown who ends up robbing a bank, which is basically the first 10 minutes of the film, and then the rest of the movie plays out in a very comical way between three particular actors. Quick Change, of course, like I said, this is a 1990 American crime comedy film, which has two directors, Howard Franklin and Bill Murray, in their directing debuts. Howard Franklin, I don't know too much about him. He only did a few movies himself. Let's see, he wrote some movies and he directed some of which I've heard of, but I have not even seen. One of which was The Man Who Knew Too Little, which I did see back in 1997. It was a spy comedy starring Bill Murray. It was kind of like, I don't know, maybe a sense of like James Bond mixed with Austin Powers in a sense, you know, because Austin Powers was big back in the late 90s, of course. You know, Mike Myers starring in a titular role, and of course, you know, Pierce Brosnan had just starred in a couple. Well, I think the first of his James Bond career, which was GoldenEye, and I think Tomorrow Never Dies did come out in 1997 as well. So yeah, the spy franchise was heavy underway, of course, you know, and then you had Spy Hard with Leslie Nielsen, you know, that came out around that time. So yeah, I guess they figure, you know, Bill Murray, you know, he was fit for a role of that nature. And of course, the year before that, one movie I have not seen, which was Larger Than Life, which again stars Bill Murray with, you know, while he's on his journey, I guess, transporting or befriending a large elephant. But like I said, I've never seen the movie, so all I know is it's Bill Murray with an elephant. But Howard Franklin, he seemed to have done quite a bit of work with Sean Connery. Then looks like he was in a film, you know, he directed a film or two with Joe Pesci and a few others of such. And I think the last movie, which was a made-for-TV movie titled The King of 7B, which Howard Franklin wrote and produced, but he only directed 3 movies, and one of which was Quick Change, of course, and he did The Public Eye, which stars Joe Pesci and Barbara Hershey, and also Larger Than Life, which was his last directing debut. But yeah, Quick Change is an interesting gem of a movie. This is based on the novel of the same name by Jay Cronley, and I never heard of the book at all. And yeah, apparently the book came out in 1981. It was amongst a bunch of different novels that has come out within a 20-year period, actually, from 1977 to 1997. Novels include Fall Guy, Screwballs, Good Vibes, Quick Change, Cheap Shot, Funny Farm, which of course was later adapted into the film Funny Farm, starring Chevy Chase, Walking Papers, and Shoot. So yeah, these were, let's see, Jay Cronley was an American newspaper columnist for the Tulsa World and author of many works of humorous fiction. So yeah, he had a few humorous books, and of course, like I said, one of them that we are reviewing today is Quick Change. This movie stars Bill Murray, Gina Davis, who was in her prime at this time in the late 80s and early 90s. Randy Quaid, of course, he is always comedic in whatever roles that he has. And he does have some serious roles as well. So Randy Quaid, he is a very underrated, pretty very well respected actor on my end. He was very well respected. He's a very good actor. And of course, Jason Robards, I think that's how you pronounce his name. Robards, yeah, Jason Robards in a role. So, Quick Change follows three people that are on an elaborate bank robbery and their subsequent escape. And of course, the movie is filmed and set in New York City. And Quick Change is the second adaptation of Cronley's novel after the 1985 Franco-Canadian film Hold Up. It is also the only directorial credit in Bill Murray's career. Yes, Bill Murray, he only directed one movie in his career, and that was this movie. And it was even said, so I've seen a couple interviews. I've seen one interview that was done on a podcast for SiriusXM with Gina Davis, and my God, I don't know when they did this interview, but God, she not only is she old, but she just sounds so old sounding. Like she was very old for her. She's not 69 years old. God damn. And it's almost sounded like she had like throat cancer. I think just the way she sounded. Her overall voice tone. I'm like, damn. I know she's old, but she's already sounded like she's 90 years old in a sense. I mean, no harm to her, no offense to her and all, but I was like, God damn. But yeah, apparently during this movie, Bill Murray was quote unquote supposedly harassing the actors behind the scenes, including Gina Davis. I guess, I don't know, sexually harassing her, just harassing her or whatever. And then, of course, this podcast went on to talk about, many years later, the subsequent Me Too movement, the hashtag Me Too movement, where all these actresses come out and say, oh, I was harassed and sexually abused by this person or that person back in the day, Look who they locked up. Bill Cosby. They locked up Harvey Weinstein, who is, suffering from health conditions and shit. But yeah, apparently, back in the day, Bill Murray was such an asshole to work with, apparently. But that was even said, for movies like Caddyshack. Even Harold Ramis, when he was directing Caddyshack, they were talking about, Bill Murray's real strict scheduling, his acting schedule for certain movies. He had a certain time that he came in, did his role, did his part, and then boom, he was out. He was very strict about a lot of things. So yeah, I guess, in Hollywood, Bill Murray was just one of those guys that, you either enjoyed working with or you probably didn't. But when you got the finished product, which stars Bill Murray, it almost seems like maybe it's flawless. Maybe he didn't have too many issues filming it. I mean, after all, Groundhog Day, when Groundhog Day came out, him and Harold Ramis, they had a feud with each other and they didn't speak for a couple decades, and then he ended up mending things with Harold Ramis in the end before Ramis died tragically back in, I think it was 2013 or 2014, I think it was. So yeah, this movie, like I said, upon its release, it was a commercial failure. It did not meet its budget of $17 million and only made $15.3 million. But it was very well received. It had very positive reviews. And of course, with praise to Bill Murray's performance and humor. Now, you got to think, Bill Murray, he had a slew of movies in the 80s and the 90s. And usually, even during the 80s, a lot of movies like Caddyshack, Meatballs, Ghostbusters, all those kind of movies, that really put him on the map of comedy, especially Ghostbusters. He's very well known for his role. And of course, a year before this movie came out, he was in Ghostbusters 2, which even though was not very well received as the first movie, but it still did a pretty good job. It is a fan favorite for a lot of people. So yeah, Bill Murray, he has a lot of movies under his belt. He was in his prime, of course. This is 1990. You got to figure the late 90s into the late 80s into the early 90s, This is where a lot of great actors, they start picking up these roles, and they're either good or they're bad, or they are very cherished or they're very loved, and that kind of nature. So, what is this movie about? Okay, so before I go into it, and you guys always know there's always going to be some kind of spoiler alert. So before you guys finish up here, go check the movie out. Unless you want me to continue on, just keep on listening. So the movie does start out the first 10 minutes or so of this film, as you see on the poster itself. Yes, Bill Murray is in a clown suit holding balloons, and that's how the movie starts out. He comes in off a subway, and he just goes into a random bank, and the first person he sees is a guard that's locking up, and he holds a gun up to him. He said, "I am here to rob the bank." So he ends up, holding everybody hostage. The police come. He's robbing the bank. He's robbing it for a million or so, a couple $1 million. And the first 10 minutes of the film, it just plays out like a standard bank robbery kind of thing. It's comical in a sense, the way it plays out, especially the way he handles the police over the phone. And then he asks for demands. He asks for a helicopter. He asks for a bus. He asks for a monster truck. He asks for this and that. And he tells the cops, for everything that shows up on site, like for every demand that was made, like for a helicopter, okay, one hostage gets released. And of course, in the whole group of hostages, there's two particular people that he picks out. The first one was played by Randy Quaid. He's dressed up like a bum. He's got a beard and everything. He's real scared. He's real anxious. He's like, "Oh my God, I'm gonna die. I'm gonna die. I shouldn't be here today. Help me, help me." That kind of thing. And so he leaves it up to everybody else. Okay, since I'm being very generous, which one of y'all decides to go first? And they all point to Randy Quaid's character. So he removes him from there, and he goes out of the bank. He disappears off site. He does a couple interviews with the cops, and then he's gone. And of course, the next person that he releases is a woman named Phyllis, played by Gina Davis. So, in a very clever way, and you don't see it on camera, but you see the after effect where not only does Phyllis end up leaving the bank, but so does this other guy who ends up leaving that you really don't quite see in the group of hostages, but it turns out to be Bill Murray's character named Grimm. And he's in a disguise. He's not the clown anymore. They play it out, and they make their way out of there. And you almost think it's a hostage situation where he's taking the hostage with him, right? So they end up leaving, and then it turns out that him, Phyllis, and Randy Quaid's character, Loomis, they're all friends, and they're all in this together. So it's a total of 3 bank robbers who have planned this heist for months. And of course, Phyllis and Grimm, their boyfriend and girlfriend, and Loomis is just that dim-witted friend who's along for the ride, the best friend. So they just schemed a bank out of $1 million, and now they're trying to make a clean escape out of the city, make it to the airport with over $1 million between the 3 of them. And then, of course, in the midst of all this, while the police are still at the bank thinking that this terrorist is inside the bank still, he's on the other side of the river or something. He's on his way out of there. And then, of course, Loomis ends up blowing their cover almost barely by honking a car horn. So that kind of sets them off a little bit. So now the police, they're on a manhunt for not just the clown, but then the one police officer, the detective. He's now figuring out, okay, maybe there are more to this. So as their case starts to unravel throughout this movie, which is one of the subplots, of course, and it's staged out pretty well. It's staged out pretty well, and of course, it's almost like on the edge of your seat, not action, but you're feeling for these other characters too. So they're trying their damnedest to make their way out of the city to the airport and fly off, on a flight out of there to go somewhere where they want to go. And it just ends up being one big disaster after another, with a ton of close calls of the cops barely making it to the scene to capture them, to know who exactly it is. And let me tell you, every scene it's just as comical as the next. Especially one particular scene where they go into this random building just to stay out of sight of the police. And it turns out there's a mafia. There's a mafia group sitting inside waiting for somebody to come by and take a job for the mob. And he plays it out very well. Say, oh, so and so sent me. You can call them up. Da 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 da. And he plays it out real well. He ends up scheming. He ends up scamming the mob out of $6,000 before they eventually narrowly escape the scene on a bus. So there is quite a few different segments in this movie where it's just like, you know, what could possibly go wrong next, basically, for these three characters. What could go wrong in every sense. And it does have not a very tongue-in-cheek moment toward the end where you feel like these three robbers are about to meet their maker. You know, they're about to be arrested. But it turns out everything ends up in their favor. Things end up with a twist to where they not only escape the police, but outsmart them as well until that very last second of the movie where the police detective realizes who the hell it was and realizes that it is too late. They're already in the air, in the airplane, flying off. But I gotta give it to, like, with this movie, with the way it played out, for being 89 minutes, you know, just an hour and a half long, it is paced out very well. I actually wanted more to the movie. This is one of those rare occasions where I see a movie and I want a little bit more to it. And I feel like it ended a little bit quickly, but you know what? Typical comedies of the 80s and the 90s, they only last 90 minutes long, and that's all the long that you need for a good movie. So there was a good amount of story in this film. There's a good amount of comedy, especially when it involves Bill Murray and, of course, Randy Quaid himself. Randy Quaid, you know, he plays a dim-witted friend. You know, his overall physicality in the movie, you know, with his character is just genius. You know, it's just Randy Quaid being Randy Quaid, you know, in his comical role. This is not your typical Cousin Eddie from National Lampoon's Vacation. You know, this is a whole other character that's played by Randy Quaid, and he does it really well. He does it really good. And I just got to say, like, the back and forth pacing between two different plots. You know, you got the three characters that are on the run with over $1 million trying to get out of New York City. Everything that couldn't possibly go wrong goes wrong. And then on the other hand, you got the police department seeking out where these three are, where they're going to hit next, where they're going to go. So you got an even amount of story between the two that line up with each other perfectly, with nothing too open-ended. Nothing really open-ended. The ending is, like I said, it's kind of tongue-in-cheek for some people, but I feel like the ending, it may have deserved a little bit better, but it was definitely satisfying on my end, and I do applaud, you know, for the movie, you know, being what it is. And of course, going into the reception of the movie, even though they did say when the movie released it was a commercial failure, I don't see why it was a commercial failure. But I mean, let's okay. So, Rotten Tomatoes, the film has an approval rating of 84%. 84% on a critic website. A critic review website. They said it was a commercial failure. It was a commercial failure because it didn't make any money. You know, it barely made its budget back. But it's got an approval rating of 84% with an average rating of 6.7 out of 10. The website's critics' consensus reads that Quick Change makes the most of its clever premise with a smartly skewed heist comedy that leaves plenty of room for its talented cast to shine. And it does. You know, Gina Davis, Bill Murray, Randy Quaid, and there's even a slew of actors in here that do make appearances. You got appearances from Kurtwood Smith from that 70s show in there. And he plays an asshole role very well. Almost as big as asshole as his role in the movie RoboCop. You got Stanley Tucci, and I recognized him from quite a few movies I saw, especially Beethoven, which came out a year or two after this movie did. You got Victor Argo, Phil Hartman. You got Tony Schwab or Shalab, whatever his fucking name is, the monk himself. He's got a role in there. You got Bob Elliott. You got Jason Robards, Philip Bosco in there. You got a few, well-known actors in this movie, of course, and it all plays out very well. The main cast is especially. This like I said, this movie left plenty of room for its talented cast to shine, and it definitely does show. Metacritic, it has a weighted average of 56 out of 100 based on 17 critics, indicating mixed or an average reviews. Several critics claim that it was one of Bill Murray's finest roles, a jaded man who has had too much of the Big Apple. Also praised were the strong performances by the supporting cast, particularly Robards as the police chief, who, while almost as burned out as Murray was, is still determined to capture the robbers as a swan song to his long career. That pretty much explains it right there. Like, they say this is one of Bill Murray's finest roles. This very underrated gem right here, one of his finest roles, and we're not talking about Caddyshack or even Groundhog Day, which came out just a few years after, which turned out was one of his best in his career, of course. Roger Ebert, at the time that he was alive for this, he wrote that Quick Change is funny, but not an inspired comedy. It has two directors, and I wonder if that has anything to do with the inability to be more than just efficiently entertaining. Now, maybe having two different directorial parts in this movie, maybe that's something that may have been a downfall for the movie for some or for most. But other than that, some movies do work well with duos, some work with trios, and a lot more work well with others. Now, during production, as I was stating earlier on about Geena Davis's appearance on a podcast, so in her 2022 memoir, Dying of Politeness, Geena Davis claims that Bill Murray sexually harassed her during their first meeting on the film by insisting on using an electric massage device on her despite her repeatedly telling him to stop. She said that he also screamed at her for being late during filming. Now, who knows? He may have been joking around about it. I don't know. But then again, if it did happen, why wasn't it reported, back then? Why wasn't it sexual harassment? I mean, I guess maybe actresses back then felt like they didn't have a voice. They felt like if they did something, if they spoke up and said something, it could have ruined their career or something. So I was like, why wait 30 years later? It just makes no sense to me, but I really don't know. Jonathan Demme was initially chosen to direct the film, but then was no longer available. Even Ron Howard was approached to direct it. He turned it down after reading the script, saying that there was no character to root for. And then again, how Ron Howard is. He's all up for perfection. That's him. But Ron Howard does have some good films under his belt. Don't get me wrong. But for him to say that there was no character to root for, yeah, maybe so. Because there is no really... Well, there's good guys, there's bad guys, but, I think I would root for... Even the dumbest, like Randy Quaid, just root for his comedy to see what he does or says next, So, yeah, there is no real heroine in this movie to really root for, which I guess I kind of agree with. Because you're following, three people who just schemed a bank out of $1 million are on the run now. And then you got cops where you're like, oh, you hope that the bad guys get away, or maybe hope, maybe the cops will get them, but, it turns out differently for them. After unsuccessful attempts to agree on a suitable director, Howard Franklin and Bill Murray opted to direct the picture themselves. And, of course, Howard Franklin was also the one who wrote the script for the movie. So, what do I think about this movie in general? Now, even though I am a fan of Bill Murray, I have not seen a whole lot of films that he has directed. Of course, growing up through the 80s and the 90s, of course, I've seen movies like Ghostbusters, I've seen Groundhog Day, I've seen Caddyshack, I vaguely seen Stripes. I've seen pieces in here and there of Stripes. I've seen some of his work in the 90s. I've seen Zombieland, which, he was a cameo in there for a good bit. But I will say, like, Bill Murray, he just has that very tongue-in-cheek type of comedy, or his comedic style. It may not be for everybody, and some people will say that they did not find any humor in his comedies, in his comedy shtick, so to say. But I will say, like, he does a magnificent job trying to keep up with his role in this movie. Like, he is just constantly on the go in this movie. There's almost like no real time for him to stop and even think in his role. Randy Quaid, just as comedic as he can be. I definitely got to give him praise. And of course, Gina Davis, Gina Davis being Gina Davis, Jason Robards that plays the detective, he is definitely one for the books. You follow along with this guy, and he just seems like he's something out of the movie like Airplane or something like that, like a serious role out of movies like Airplane or something. He has that serious quirk with him, but it's almost also very comedic on his end too. And I feel like this movie, as well as it was received in a sense, I feel like it's very underrated. This is a gem that is definitely something to look up, and definitely, something to really try out. Just definitely check it out and see what you think about it. Especially the first 10 minutes of the film where he's a clown robbing a bank. If you see that scene alone, that should get you hooked right away. Now, is he dressed like that for the entire movie? No. It just pretty much sets it up for that, but it does it very well, and it's very clever in some spots, and I really did enjoy this film, and I'm very glad to share this film with you guys. So, I got to give this movie a rating, an 8 out of 10. Yeah, even though it may be kind of shortchanged a little bit in some areas, but other than that, I really did enjoy it. I really did enjoy the performances from all the actors, even the cameos, even somebody like Phil Hartman. Phil Hartman, he was just up and coming back in the day. I think he had just started, or he was getting ready to start on Saturday Night Live. So you got Phil Hartman, you got Phil Hartman in there, and you got comedy geniuses of Bill Murray and Randy Quaid in there as well. So you got a mixture of a lot of different little things put into this movie, and it worked out very well. So 8 out of 10, I definitely feel like it's definitely worth a watch, and it's a very fair rating on my end. So that pretty much does it for today's episode of Cinemacast, guys. I'd like to thank you guys so much for checking in, listening to today's podcast, watching today's podcast. If you guys enjoy our content on these channels, please leave a like, subscribe, and follow down below. Social media links and everything else is down in the description section if you guys want to follow us anywhere for updates and much more. I want to thank you all for joining me today for today's feature, which was Quick Change, starring Bill Murray, Randy Quaid, and Gina Davis. And guys, until next time, catch you right back here to cinema.